Good evening and welcome to tonight's program on Big Data and Predictive Analytics by the MIT Enterprise Forum of the Northwest. My name is Jimmy Gia and I am the chair of the chapter here, and I'm very happy to, be competing with good weather, and so thank you very much for showing up today. A little bit about the MIT Enterprise Forum. We are here to educate, entertain, and inspire future entrepreneurs, and we do the series of technology leadership programs to be able to demonstrate the sort of work that we do here in Seattle. And so how many people here are coming to your first program by the chapter? Okay, great. Well, welcome very much, and we hope to see you again. This is the last program of this particular season, and we will be announcing our next season within the next couple of weeks, starting in September. So we definitely look forward to having you come back and join us. A couple of things. We are completely a chapter-run, a volunteer-run organization. We're part of 28 different chapters across the country. The program notes said this particular chapter was founded in 1984, and so we're 30 years old now. But after talking to some of our former presidents, it turns out we were founded in 1981 in the basement of one of our founders. And so for 3 years, we too operated out of a basement. But being volunteer run, we have over 70 volunteers per year come through and participate in our programs. And so we have a wonderful team this time. Renee Gastineau, Jesse Burns, and please stand up when your name is called. Shirley Lunday, Chris Lierley, Fortunato Vega, Stephen Elston, Wister Kay, Will Dixon, Kirby Bartholomew, who was the team lead, Jeremy Bartram, Rahesh David, Donna Hines, Jason Nolte, Trina Colby, Yume Singh, and Ben Premack. And so without these people, we could not put on this program. So thank you very much. And all of these volunteers start off as audience members, so we do encourage you to come up and talk to anyone with these green labels right here. And we're happy to get you involved, whether in marketing or volunteers, to help put these programs together. And last but not least, none of these programs would be possible without any of our sponsors. And so I'd like to mention our season sponsors, Firmer, Lawrence & Haug, and Point B. Thank you so much for helping us put on the season again. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Emily Parkhurst, who is with the Puget Sound Business Journal. Emily hails from faraway Portland, Maine, and she was an education reporter over there and has been with the Puget Sound Business Journal now for 2 years. She is really fascinated by the super small as well as the super big, and sees the growth of cloud computing as something really big and really starting to take off here in Seattle, and wants to rebrand us as Cloud City, not because of our weather. And after moving here, she has also started brewing beer, and so definitely she is now a local. So Emily, thank you very much. Here you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And just a little correction, I was brewing beer in Maine, and I continued brewing beer here in Seattle because you couldn't not. So thank you all for coming tonight. I realize it's gorgeous weather outside, so you're really sacrificing, but I think it's going to be worth the sacrifice. I think we have a really excellent panel for you this evening. You're really going to enjoy it, and there will be time for you guys to ask questions at the end and hopefully interact a little bit with the panelists. I'm curious, before we get started here, how many of you feel like you know quite a bit or would consider yourselves experts in predictive analytics? 2 of you. Okay, great. How many of you feel like you have sort of a medium knowledge? Okay, good. And how many of you were like, predictive analytics, that sounds interesting? Yeah, okay, great. So we got a good mix. I think this is going to be a really great event for all of you. So to start us off, Stephen, one of the volunteers, Stephen Elston, is going to come up and do just a little presentation, sort of an introduction to predictive analytics and big data, to hopefully give you guys a little bit of a foundation, so when the panel comes up here, you have that foundation and we can jump right in. So Stephen.
Thank you, Emily. So as Emily said, I'm going to do a quick overview here of predictive analytics, since we have people with various depths of knowledge and one expert who can go to take a quick nap here. So first off, let me just start with a definition. So I'm going to there's a lot of possible definitions of predictive analytics, and maybe even some controversy about what exactly do we mean by predictive analytics. But I'm going to step out a bit on the thin ice and just say predictive analytics are some sort of typically mathematical method we use to predict or forecast future outcomes based on data we've collected on past events. So simple enough to say, but not so simple when you think about what all the implications might be. One area of confusion is all the different names and monikers that predictive analytics go by. You ask a statistician and they'll say, well, of course, that's statistics. You ask a computer scientist and they'll say, well, of course, it's machine learning. You ask someone from management science and they'll say, well, of course, it's forecasting. You ask a operations research person or certain applied math people and they'll say, well, decision theory, that's what it is. And often these same names different names apply to exactly the same, underlying mathematical technique. So just a bit of confusion. Another source of confusion is, what's the difference between predictive analytics and business intelligence? And historically, predictive analytics is forward-looking. Like I said, we're trying to forecast future outcomes or predict future outcomes. Business intelligence generally is backward-looking because we're trying to report on what's happened, and current status based on history. Although if you look at the actual software out there nowadays, business intelligence packages are adding lots of predictive analytics. Predictive analytics packages often have a lot of business intelligence capability. So it's definitely a fuzzy line to make that distinction. So let me just talk about what's new and what's not, and I think we'll hear some what's really new from the panel here for sure. Predictive analytics as a subject area, as an academic area, and even applications are hardly new. Sir Francis Galton wrote the original paper on linear regression, which is still widely used, in 1894. So think about that, 120 years ago, when state-of-the-art transportation was steam-powered. The new things were electrification of cities and this newfangled thing called the telephone, right, which probably never caught on, I guess. So spool forward half a century, and Joseph Brixton introduced the logistic regression model. So now we have a model where we can make decisions between sort of what's called binary distributions, but basically yes-no answers. Another mere quarter century later, James McQueen developed and published the k-means clustering algorithm. And in fact, if you look at your favorite stats package manual, the default method is probably McQueen's method. And likewise, analytics software packages have been around for a long time. SPSS, tried and true, was introduced in 1968. SAS had their first release, full release, I should say, in 1972. And the S language, which R is based on, is one of the early interactive packages, was introduced in 1978 by Bell Labs. But a lot's happened and is continuing to happen. It's a very exciting, changing area. One area is the impact. Emily is excited about cloud computing, as am I, and the ability to have these large clusters of servers with tremendous computing power and huge storage capacities brings us to what some people call the 3 V's of big data. Volume, we can handle and we can analyze enormous volumes we couldn't have imagined 20 years ago. Variety from data sources, all different kinds of data, spatial data, text data, you name it. And at unprecedented velocity, the speed with which we can do these large-scale things continues to increase. There's lots of new methods. 2 of our panelists are experts in geospatial methods, but other computationally intensive methods that were more or less academic toys are now in daily production use all over the place. So let's talk about where some of this has had an impact on businesses and even on our daily life. So how many people used a search engine today? Okay, so hopefully you got some value out of predictive analytics there. If you were shopping online, you probably saw recommendations, another form of predictive analytics. If you made a payment with your credit card, including to pay your registration for the MIT Enterprise Forum, you Predictive analytics were used as a fraud screening. Predictive analytics are used in retail and to segment customers, and the political scientists and political parties are experts. I guarantee all of us have been micro-segmented politically. They know more about how we're going to vote than we probably do. And then, spam filtering. I'm very grateful for spam filtering, and that's a big data predictive analytics problem. And then there's just areas of technology that couldn't even exist without predictive analytics, like genome sequencing. Simply impossible if you couldn't do very, very large scale. But there are pitfalls like every new technology, or, well, it's not so new if it's been around for 120 years. But the biggest problem, I think, in general is, like a lot of technologies, it's the wrong application, or in this case, asking the wrong question. If you don't have a clear view of what are you trying to predict and what business value is that going to bring, you're off on the wrong foot, and none of the rest of it matters, really. You can also hit limits on data. Maybe you know exactly what you want to do, but you can't find the data sources, or somehow they're inaccessible because of legacy IT or something like that. Or even more subtly, they may be highly biased data sources, so they don't give you a full picture. A classic example is, we may know a lot about our customers, but what about the people who never became our customers? We got nothing in the database, or very little in the database about them. So we have a very biased sample in cases like that. Also pitfalls in terms of having realistic, or sometimes people have unrealistic expectations, and the other, sort of the twin of that demon, optimistic interpretation. So, it's inevitable that spam filters let some spam through. Recommenders don't always give good recommendations. Fraud occurs in credit cards in spite of the best analytics. So you have to expect a certain amount of error rate. But because there's always uncertainty around that, there's some tendency maybe to put on the rose-colored glasses and go, oh, I see exactly what I want to see here, because it's, there's a little fuzz always on this. Another pitfall is the mistaking correlation for causation. And so kind of the legendary story, I'm not even sure it's true, is Sir Francis Galton, who 120 years ago invented linear regression, mentioned in a talk that it was extremely high correlation, and that the more top hats you own, if you were a man in London, just before the end of the 19th century, you'd live longer. And the data was absolutely unequivocal about this. And, well, think about it, though. The average working bloke in London in, 1899 or something couldn't afford any top hats, lived a short, brutish life. Only the very wealthy had a closet full of nice top hats. So, and they had the best food and the medical care and all that. So, obviously, apparently people realized he was being a bit facetious, and there was no sudden surge in top hat sales. Overfitting is another problem, especially when you get to the very large data sets with very many variables. It's an easy trap to fall into. You're fitting the test data or the training data very well, but actually you're not predicting anything when you apply it to the real world. And finally, let me just comment about bigger bad data. There's because there's a lot of interest and a lot of value, honestly, being generated with big data analytics, but it isn't always true that more data is more better. You can have a bigger sample that's still got a lot of biases, or introduces a lot more errors and things like that. So you need to be a bit careful as you scale up. So with that, I'm going to switch the slides and turn this back over to Emily. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was great. All right. I'll give him a second to switch this over. So I'm going to welcome the panelists at this point. First up, we have Kevin Foreman. Kevin is the General Manager of Geoanalytics at INRIX. So welcome, Kevin.
Thank you.
We also have Andrew Rogers, who is the CTO and founder of SpaceCurve. And lastly, we have Peter Schrader. He is a data analytics partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Great, well, thank you all. We've had this great intro, and I think that this kind of gave everybody a good platform, as I mentioned, but I think it would be a really great way to start off with each of you just give us a sort of the creative ways that you've seen companies, either your company or your customers' companies, using predictive analytics to solve problems or even come up with problems that need to be solved from the predictive analytics that are available now.
So why don't I start? I'll kick it off here. So as I was introduced, my name is Pete Schrader. I am responsible for the data analytics practice. Slightly different than the other individuals, my focus is really around financial and risk and compliance analytics and using predictive analytics to drive that market. Let me give you one of my favorite examples. It's been something that we've been doing for a little while, what we've called Project Sherlock. As the name describes, we're trying to identify unusual activity, and the unusual activity that we're specifically looking for is fraudulent journal entries. Many of you probably experienced a lot of the challenges several years back with a lot of companies falsifying journal entry activity as the foundation for their financial statements, and then when they were public companies, they got that information wrong. A lot of investors took a pretty significant hit in those markets. We decided that that was something that we needed to get ahead of. We needed to build a tool, and essentially what the tool would do is it would look through significant volumes of journal entry data, and we're talking about large public companies. They've got terabytes of data, tens of 20s of terabytes of data, and essentially there's, I'll say billions of records that make up these populations. And so what we've accomplished in our analysis is identifying specific data triggers, taking populations of elements from roughly 300, narrowing it down through linear regression down to approximately 10, and then identifying how we could use that in a multivariate regression, building a model to essentially identify relationships between certain types of unusual activity. Maybe it's a manual entry, maybe there's an unusual type of relationship between something that might be increasing revenue and increasing an asset to make a company look better. The interesting piece of the equation is that the model was so effective that not only did we use it to actually identify fraudulent activity in companies, but we were also able to take it to companies where fraudulent activity was known, and we were able to say, okay, let's understand the breadth and depth of what that fraudulent activity might be. And again, the predictive analytics were extremely powerful. I've got several other examples, but I'll pass it to my colleagues here before I dive into a few more.
So, as I was introduced, Andrew Rogers, and I've been actually dealing with real-time telemetry data, Internet of Things, sensor data, and doing analysis on that. My company actually builds a platform that allows you to basically ingest and fuse enormous quantities of real-time sensing data from many, many different data sources, whether it's cell phone telemetry, mobile phones. And one of the interesting use cases that I've seen of using predictive analytics with cell phone telemetry data. So this is kind of tracking the motion of people. They can be anonymous. We don't actually need to know. We just are looking at the motion of people. Is that in Africa, they often have problems with bandits and warlords and other things in many of the remote villages. And the governments in many of those countries try to, clamp down on that and send the military out to stop it. But the problem is that they're always a day late and $1 short because they find out about it from reports hours after the guys have gone through. So what they started doing is analyzing all the cellular phone telemetry data, and they noticed that in certain times, the average motion of people suddenly slows down a lot, and then it gets back up. And they started studying this, and it turns out that, well, when the people stop moving, it's because a warlord is coming through town. They all go inside and they just sit down. And so they started building this model of people go hiding when the bandits come through or the warlords. And so what they started doing is saying, okay, where are we seeing this motion? It's not actually the motion of the people, it's this pattern of people not moving that moves through the countryside, usually along roads. And so they could start to predict where down the road would most likely, was they getting this data off the cellular telemetry real time, where they would most likely find the bandits or warlords, an hour later. And so that was like a really interesting use case that I saw that was done out of Africa.
Super. Again, Kevin Foreman, I work for a company called INRIX. You might not have heard of INRIX. We are roadway traffic geeks based in Kirkland. We're about 400 people. Great question. Just as an aside, I think many of you are looking at business opportunities. I'll say one line and I'll give you hopefully some examples that if you squint, it'll be examples that you can take to your business and your life and move forward. And the first one is this. It's easier to make and sell painkillers than vitamins. It's easier to sell Advil than Fred Flintstones. And everybody hates traffic. Death, taxes, and traffic. So INRIX is a roadway traffic geek company, definitely a big data company. We have billions of anonymous GPS data points coming to us every 15 seconds from over 100 million vehicles, so that we really know what's going on the roadways of America. Traffic forecasts are really important. Understanding, like this meeting today, Peter's about to ask, what's the best time to leave to get to the airport tomorrow? And we're all just going to guess. You don't need to guess. We know when the Mariners are playing. We know when road construction is happening. And understanding when's the best time to leave to get to the airport, to get to that job interview, is very hard predictive analytics. And we do traffic forecasts the way people do weather forecasts. But just to tease you on a few, and we'll talk about these. When the company we started 9 years ago, we had no idea how valuable this big data was. Because as you know, it's not about data per se. It's about the information and insight that you glean from the data in your businesses. And most of the use cases around traffic and roadways are about avoiding traffic. Your traffic influence navigation for your cars, traffic influence fleet for UPS and Federal Express, travel time signs above the highway that we power for DOTs or infrastructure building. But there's a whole class of people who actually want traffic. Billboard companies, retail site selection, predictive analytics. If I'm a restaurant now called QSRs, by the way, they're not called fast food restaurants anymore. If I'm looking at these 6 locations based on traffic patterns, because it's easier to turn right than left, what's going to predict my sales forecast for these 6 locations? Those are just 5 quick examples of I had no idea, the company had no idea 9 years ago that we would be into all these different use cases that people are turning magic of this data into real business insight. And the lesson I hope that you would take away from this is look differently at the data in your organizations and really understand the use cases, because there's so much magic that can happen in your organizations. And getting the use cases nailed, I think we sort of talked this earlier, and pulling it back from that rather than pushing the data, take the use case, take the actual application, then pull the big data in that way. You'll be much more successful, I think, than pushing a string, if you will.
Actually, I think that leads really well into the next question, Kevin. Can you talk about a new direction that predictive analytics might have pushed INRIX or one of your customers that you didn't predict? I know it's about predictive analytics, but that you didn't predict.
Well, these things that we have in our pockets are pretty amazing devices. They're personal, intimate devices you don't even share with your spouse. That's not necessarily true with your PC and your car. And yet, we have access to all human information. And what do my kids do? They watch cat videos. Just as an aside. But here's a great example of that, which is traffic is very personalized. Unlike weather, which, Seattle has the same weather, most people don't care about traffic around them, per se. They only care about traffic in front of them. Right? If there's an accident 20 feet behind me, it's, yes, I've avoided it. I care about traffic in front of me. So location and personalization is really, really important. And it might be applicable to your business models of knowing your location, knowing where you're going, because 100 million people still get traffic from traffic on the 3s and traffic helicopters. Those will soon be dead. Because I don't care about the rent and S curves. I don't know how many of you go over with the rent and S curves. I feel sorry for you. They're terrible every day, but most of us don't, and we don't care about it across the board. So I think the real opportunities are really understanding these devices, sort of big data, small screen, which I think is sort of one of the topics. There's so much opportunity in there for you and your organizations, because this is a personal, intimate device. It knows your location. It knows how you think. For example, can I just say one more example? My alarm clock rings every day at 5:01 on this device. 5:01 because I want to steal 1 minute from the day, so I feel like I sort of won one. But it's silly. Monday through Friday, I go to the same place all the time. We should have traffic-influenced alarm clocking. right? We know how long accidents take. They know how to dissipate. I don't have to listen to the news and then panic and scramble and get my kids upset, and my wife upset, and my dog upset.
Keep listening to the news.
Yeah, you should just listen and roll. So, our kids will look back and say, I can't believe you didn't take advantage. Let me give you another real quick example. Starbucks. Starbucks has got one of the best apps on the planet, right? Well, I landed in Toronto the other night, and I said, look for Starbucks, right? Because I'm from Seattle. I don't know what Dunkin' Donuts really is or Tim Hortons quite yet. Major fail. Oh, I don't know if anybody's from Starbucks here, sorry. Major fail, here's why. I don't really want Starbucks around me per se. I want Starbucks that are open. It showed me all the ones that were closed. That's not used. It has a little thing called a clock on here. It showed me the Starbucks around me. I'm driving from the airport to my hotel. I want to see Starbucks in front of me. These are just simple things that we'll look back and say, ugh, I can't believe that they didn't understand that I was driving. You can tell I'm going 5 miles an hour. You can't walk 5 miles an hour as a whole. And you can't hardly drive less than 5 miles an hour. So it's pretty simple to detect when a person's driving or in a bus versus not, which makes that decision of, if walking, can turn around, show me Starbucks behind me. If driving, show me exits in front of me only. That's just one small example. My advice to the audience is, when you go back to your organization, look at your organizations, look at the lens a little bit differently. And there's so much opportunity in these personal, intimate devices. To get invited into the sanctuary of your users in here is a magical place that big, important companies and companies from this audience will be generated in the next few years. Guaranteed it.
Great. Andrew? Do you want to jump in on maybe some, I guess what I'm looking for is sort of a valuable new direction that you saw taken as a result of predictive analytics?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things that I've actually seen that as a result of predictive, one of the problems that we've had with predictive analytics generally is that you kind of have to know what you're looking for before you ask the question. And this has been a problem forever. It's like, well, so if I don't ask the question, then I won't know what's going to go on. So one of the things that we've seen as a really important direction, for my company, what I see in applications is this kind of activity analysis where we basically collect all the data we can from every data source possible, and we just put it together. For my company, we register it in space and time, because space and time are like the primary keys of reality. You can do all sorts of amazing analytics when they're there. But the problem is that when you see when people want to know what's going to happen, if they don't know what they're like, anomaly detection, risk management, these are actually the areas where it comes in. It's like security, looking for terrorists, whatever. And the problem is that they don't know exactly what they're looking for until after it happens. And so the way they've started getting around this is like, we're just going to throw all the data into a bucket, all of it, and continuously update it. And we're going to define this as normal, because as far as we can see on the news, nothing's happening, so it's normal. And I don't know what I'm looking for exactly, but anytime you see something that's not normal based on history, we're going to assume that something interesting is going to happen in the immediate future, alert everyone, and go look at this. Because, again, they don't know that what that anomaly means, but they know something is not normal, and that becomes interesting. And it's a way they've started to work around this problem of, asking the right questions. Like, I'm not even going to try anymore. I'm going to have the data tell me what's interesting in this data, using computers. So that's.
So the data is telling you what's interesting.
Yeah, because it's the problem. It's the whole dashboard fatigue syndrome with a lot of big data analytics, where we're only letting the computers do half the work. It's like, well, we'll present the data, and then you still have to look at it and figure out and make sense of it. And that's really too much work or too much data for many types of analytic use cases and for many of the applications people want to do. So the challenge has always been, I don't want a pretty picture. I want the answer to my question, or I want it to tell me what I should do next. And it's been, making that leap. And part of the making that leap to just give me the answer I want rather than showing me all the data has been really this ability to surface anomalies or things that should be interesting or might be interesting to you. So.
Do you think that, I think data analytics for a while has been just data scientists or statisticians who have been looking at it, and now we have a I don't want to say a less sophisticated user, but I look at data analytics every single day on the traffic for our site. So do you think that has something to do with kind of this shift?
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely. One of the things I always tell people who want to get into big data is they're like, but I don't want to be a computer scientist. And I'm like, that's not the way to get into big data. The challenge we always had is that a lot of the big data tools and environments were really designed for geeks, for lack of a better word. And I am one. But the problem is that they lack the domain expertise to really make good sense and to turn that into actionable decisions that are going to add value to people, because they like slinging code around, but they don't. They haven't been steeped in, I want to analyze agricultural yields. Some people do that and they love it, and that's their job, and they understand how a little bit of difference in rainfall or weather patterns will alter agricultural output. And so there's been this kind of thing where I say it's the domain experts that can actually span the gap between the deep computer science and the end application. That's the growth area, because it's a kind of a skill set that you don't see a lot out in the wild. And to much of the visualization tools, they get you a little way there, but it's bringing it's kind of that meat in the middle, bring the technology a little closer to the person, where again, if you can surface anomalies or other things without having the person understand how to write, very complicated R scripts or something like that, that's a big step forward, because it widens the pool of domain experts that can generate value in this field.
Great.
I was going to
If you
respond to the
want,
same
yeah,
question.
please.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts come to mind. I guess I'd share one more example. We do a lot of work for brick and mortar retail and consumer clients. And one of the greatest risks that they run into is specifically on loss. That product is leaving their store, it's being stolen, it's spoiling, or basically it's just no longer in inventory. And so some of the things that we started to do is to predict how you could determine which of the stores would have a greater risk of actually losing inventory. And you start to think about the various aspects that could come into play. We came up with about 500 potential data points. One could be something as simple as a store layout, right? If there was a bathroom closest to the door, then maybe somebody might take the liberty to actually use the restroom on the way out with some of the goods. Other things that came into play were some of the social media aspects in terms of what was the user feedback from your customers in terms of how they felt the store was doing. Other very relevant activity is in terms of turnover. If you had high employee turnover, that there was likely to be greater loss. You start to take all these data points into consideration. It was very interesting to see how you could use predictive analytics to move it forward. Without going into a lot of the details, the thing that I think was most interesting that came out of that is buying data. I'm not sure how familiar you are with, obviously you can use historical data, you can talk about creating trends or basically spoofing data to create the process, but what we found very valuable is that the social media outlets that are currently out there, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, or even if you're in the, I'll say the healthcare industry, that you can buy actual data that would be something that you can use in your models. And the one thing that we found as we were going through this loss prevention exercise is that the Twitter feeds, as it relates to how individuals felt about their local store, had a direct correlation with the, if they were positive, that there would be a lower level of theft or loss, and if they were negative, that there would be a higher level. Now, normally we wouldn't have thought that that would have been something that would have been relevant, but as we bought the data, as we started to get specific details, and when you work with the large companies that would sell the data, you can get very specific information. So we were asking for specific activity at various demographics. What is the response in this area? And the interesting piece that came out of this, although we were trying to solve a problem as it related to the risk of loss, it turned out to actually flip into a marketing opportunity, and how that they could actually take the feeds of individuals that were actually corresponding about the service or about the products in this specific store, and how they could actually sell to it to get individuals individuals to be more, I'll say, directly involved with the store's success or their lack of loss. And over time, when these models were starting to be built, we thought that there would be relatively low correlation on it. And as we started to see that individuals in the various markets actually started to build a rapport with their stores, and they wanted the stores to essentially stay in business and do well. And so we saw that, the greater the interaction, and we got this through the big data sites, and frankly, there's an enormous amount of data that can be mined, and basically using keyword searches and starting to see how over time, if there was a negative perception of the store, how it moved to a positive perception of the store, and how that had a direct result. And that the marketing team, when they were trying to actually get individuals to be more receptive to changes or to activity, and basically start to take on more of, I'll say, a father figure, a brother figure, a sister figure, that the data analytics were extremely powerful, and that was another piece that we were able to continue to refine as we built the model to determine which stores would have the greatest risk of loss. But the marketing team was really able to take advantage of that, buying additional data that would allow them to see different aspects, different data points about customer activity, and how they felt after they left the store, and what they remembered about the service, et cetera.
So basically, you don't want to steal from your friend.
Exactly.
Perfect. I think you guys have all kind of touched on some great use cases for historical data. I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about real-time data, and using real-time data and or historical data, and if you're seeing organizations, including your own, using both at the same time, or if those are primarily used separately. And just wanted to hear a little bit about what you're observing right now, and maybe a little prediction for what you'll see in the future.
Well, one of the trends I think you can all take advantage of is a trend that we clearly see, and that's this trend, which is we as humans are starting to measure distance differently. Historically, we've measured distance with miles and kilometers, and now more and more we're measuring with minutes. How far am I from the airport? How far am I from the store? How far is my pizza from me? How far am I from my daycare? If you have any application that you're using that has the word minutes in it, miles, change it to minutes. Your customers don't measure distance in miles except for if they're in Montana. Really, that's one easy trend. Because real time, those travel time signs above the highways for the DOTs have been putting up have been a home run use case. They get in trouble often with, trouble on the waters and DOT spending tax dollars effectively. But travel time signs are just one instantiation of a trend that you can all leverage, because it's all real time. I care how far am I from the airport, and it really matters if it's Friday at 5 o'clock or Tuesday at 4. And same thing with all sorts of use cases that we get involved with, from delivery to buying homes to restaurants, insurance. Wall Street wants to understand, for example, what's going on with economic activity. For example, the first thing you do when you get a job is you don't buy a car or a house or a white appliance, you drive to work. And by noon on Black Friday, we can tell you what's going to happen for Christmas shopping, because we know how many cars go into the Walmart parking lots. By noon on Black Friday, we can tell you what the forecast is for Christmas, because that's an economic driver versus last year. But real time is very powerful, very, very powerful. And real time to us means every 60 seconds. As a quick aside, I got a scathing email from a woman in Portugal, at least I think it was scathing because Google translated the Portuguese for me, saying, how dare we call our INRIX Traffic mobile app, which is a free mobile app you can download, real time. She turned right in Lisbon into some congestion, and it was like 2 minutes earlier, because we only update her app every 60 seconds. And she wanted to burn me an effigy on the street because we called our application real time, and 2 minutes was not real time. That's how powerful real-time data can really, really be. It's just one example. And I think, again, squint in your organizations and just dream to say, if you could have this information in real time, how much more of a competitive advantage could you have? How much more loss could you avoid? Because it's very, very powerful. We see it in spades all the time.
Can the two work together? Can you have historical data and real-time data working in tandem?
Yeah, we do, because we often have fill-ins where once in a while, we won't have enough data coming in despite all the traffic we have. You'll typically fall back with methods, and I'm sure the other panelists can talk about methods they use to use typical. So Black Friday is a different traffic pattern than a normal Friday. So when we see next Black Friday and we don't have enough data, or you're trying to figure out what to get to the airport, we'll use historic as a fill-in for real-time.
Andrew?
I'm very much about real time. The interesting about real time, and Kevin talked about a bit, is that the definition varies widely depending on who you ask and what industry you're in. So, if you're a stock trader on the stock exchange doing high-frequency trading, it's measured in microseconds. If you are, say, doing a mobile ad, doing location-based targeting, it might be seconds, a few orders of magnitude slower. If you're doing things like weather prediction, it's more on the order of hours. And these are the latency cycles of how often are the samples of reality updated, because ultimately you're just sampling reality and then building this kind of model, or what's the next sample going to look like? And so the sample rates vary widely. Then you have things like crop yields. Those change maybe once a day if you're doing really sophisticated sensor analytics with the satellite imaging and all that stuff, where, again, the sample rate's actually getting higher across all of these data sources over time. So that's another trend as well, is that the data is getting fresher and fresher as time goes on. So whereas today, if you had a satellite image of a cornfield in Nebraska, that is probably, or at least a couple of years ago, every 2 weeks is about the refresh rate. There are satellite constellations being launched this year, today basically, that are trying to get refresh rates down to 1 hour. So you go from 2 weeks to 1 hour. And so is it real time? Well, not if you're a high frequency trader, but it's real time, very much more so than we used to think about as being real time when you're talking about satellite imaging. And the thing that I always tell people is like, all of these measurements that we're doing, they're just sampling facts about reality. It's a measurement of some fact or true thing about reality, maybe sort of true thing. If you read the Twitter fire hose, it's marginal. But the point is that when you start constructing these, is that when you start filling in these pictures and the frequency gets up, the kind of decay curve on your picture of reality, it falls off very quickly. Predictive analytics has a shelf life. And so it's not just real time in the sense of how fast you can get the data in, it's also how fast you can get a predictive analytic out of it before the value goes to zero. And so we've seen this kind of like vicious or virtuous, depends on how you look at it, cycle, where the sampling rates are increasing, allowing us to building even more detailed models that allow us to do even more complex predictive analytics. But at the same time, it's like, that curve is falling off ever faster. And one area where we've actually seen this is with weather prediction. Right now, a lot of the classic weather prediction companies that actually say, what's the weather going to be, tomorrow. That's the kind of model they work in, because their whole process was based on a latency of 1 day as being real time. And there's a lot of companies out there in industrial companies. They actually care a lot about is it going to rain in the next hour? Because I have people deployed in the fields, off roads, and an oil patch or somewhere where I need to know how to deploy my stuff in the next hour. And it turns out there's no way to actually do that because the real-time model is tomorrow. And so there's been this kind of interesting feedback thing where there's all these companies demanding real time to mean 1 hour, because if you tell me 24 hours out, it's not useful information to me. And so that's been very much a kind of like a pattern, a thing that's been going on, is this increasingly fast cycle time for how we do analytics, how we do predictive analytics, just because most of the value is derived by how close you can get from the measurement to the actionable, kind of operation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have some agreement and some difference because the area of focus of my analytics is around finance, risk, and compliance. We generally tend not to use real-time data. The reason why we choose not to use real-time data is twofold. Number one, the quality of the data is a challenge. I'm not sure how many of you have read the Google article that just recently came out as it relates to the flu testing. What they tried to do is they tried to determine whether or not they could predict the various flu strands that would be coming out that would be affecting the various communities. And it was unfortunately a study that basically proved that predictive analytics still had some ways to go. And what they determined was that they could no better predict that this flu strand was going to come out versus this flu strand. But it was interesting. It wasn't that the models were wrong. It was that the data that was used where they saw correlation couldn't be relied upon. And if you think about that for a second, that's really interesting, right? Because if we're playing in a finance and a risk and compliance space, the quality of the data is extremely important, and you need to be able to validate it in one way, shape, or form. You can have the best models, you can have the strongest algorithms that are set up, but if the data is not good, it's going to get you a false positive, and that's going to generate some angst within your organization. So what we normally do is that we use near real-time data. So it'll be about a day lag, and what we'll have done is we'll have gone through various ways to actually scrub that data to get us comfort from a completeness perspective, from an accuracy perspective, et cetera, before we actually put that into our models. I think that over time that we're going to see that change a little bit, because we're going to be able to do that faster, which brings me to my second reason why we primarily don't use real-time data, is because of the cost. It's extremely expensive to do so if you want to ensure that it's going to have the quality. Where you're pulling the data from is going to be a challenge in terms of production environments that are actually transacting. Do you put something right on top of that and basically risk the chance of slowing that down? So there's various different degrees to look at it, but from our perspective and from when my team was doing analytics, we'll definitely use near real-time data. And the one piece that I don't know that we'll come to, but I think it's very interesting, is that we're using a 24/7 clock to do a lot of our analytics to help get closer to near real-time, but it's more of the teams that we're using to do so. And what I mean by that is that we're using an offshore shared service center model. We have a lot of strong, capable individuals that have, I'll say, a data science background, that we're able to use the time that we are from a U.S. perspective, and also leverage teams around the world to continue to drive to get to an outcome that are checking the information as it's going from point A to point Z along the way. I think there's a lot of examples that would be benefited if we could move to a real-time model, but I think that the risks of getting it wrong outweigh the chance of actually pulling that in.
Okay, great. Well, you kind of touched on something, Pete, there for a minute that I want to transition to, which is this limitation and the limitations inherent in this, especially right now, sort of early days of predictive analytics and big data. You mentioned bad data as a possible limitation, and Stephen had some in his slides earlier, but I was hoping you guys could talk a little bit about some of those limitations and maybe some pitfalls of this new predictive analytics.
Yeah. So I think comes to mind. There's three limitations, just very directly. I think one is general acceptance by the executive team. What we've found is that this is changing, but I think that there's still a show me the money type of aspect. In terms of some of the newer tools, I don't know how many of you are familiar with data visualization. Just a show of hands, how many have used it? So most of you, great. Obviously, Tableau being here in the market, that's one of the big companies. The fact of the matter is that data visualization is showing data in a format that's easily digestible by various individuals. It's also a very cheap solution, and I say cheap not in the fact that this product is not designed well, but I say it in the fact that it's very easy to get into, as opposed to needing a significant investment to begin to use a tool. It's very inexpensive. And so what we're seeing is a lot of the various business units within organization are starting to actually do their own analytics, and we're starting to see a lot of decentralization. And I think that's powerful, because I think what it's going to do is it's going to give further insight to the various business users that this is a valuable solution, and it's something that we need to take more advantage of. Not only that, but these tools can attach to any environment, whether it be an unstructured database, whether it be big data like a Hadoop or actually a relational database of an Oracle or SQL, et cetera. There's a lot of different ways that you can get to it very easily. So I think the fact that the executives are starting to see this, I think that that's a good thing. But I think that we need to see more of that. And I think a subset of that is there's been some interesting articles that everybody is becoming an analyst. And this is very interesting in that in the past, if you knew Excel, that might be the extent of where I'm going to stop with my analytic capability. But that's not the case as we start to look into the current, present, and the future. And that everybody is becoming an analyst, and that there's a greater need to do so, and that people are thirsting for more information. I think that as we start to see that trend, that I think that's going to be another component to push this along forward.
Are there dangers inherent in that? You know, and by way of an example, I mean, when you look at some of the news organizations out there, they're actually not telling their reporters how many clicks their stories are getting now because they don't want them to be driven by clicks.
So the second issue is around false positives, right? What's the risk? What's your exposure if you're going to put in place predictive analytics? By definition, prediction is your best guess at what you think is going to happen. You have no crystal ball to determine exactly what is going to be the case. And I think that that's a big challenge in that, you know, if I make a significant investment or if I make a decision to change the course of the business to go down this path as opposed to this path, what's the risk of getting it wrong? You know, but interestingly enough, you flip that to the other side. What's the risk of not doing anything?
Exactly. Right?
You think about stores like Blockbuster or something of that nature, and you think of something of Netflix, right? Netflix has a pretty strong predictive analytics solution, and they basically have been effective at, you know, weathering the storm of some of the challenges within the, you know, moving from a brick and mortar to an entirely online solution. You know, obviously Blockbuster didn't take advantage of the solution when they had the market share, and they basically rested on their laurels. And I think that you could use that as a great example of somebody who sat still and said, you know what, I've got the market share right now, I'm not going to invest in it, I don't have to worry about anybody else doing it. Well, guess what, they were wrong, right? And I think that's the second piece of the equation. The third issue that I think that you'll find around, or limitations, at least from my perspective, is around the fact that I lost my train of thought here.
Are you going to say privacy? Because that's what I was going to jump in on.
Yeah, actually, I was, and I think that the issue around privacy is actually very interesting. I don't mean to steal your thunder, but let me jump in here. I think that there is a big challenge. I don't know how many of you also saw the article about how the EU just recently reinforced what they originally said that Google cannot have in their population. If somebody chooses to opt out of personal data, that they have to respect that right. Now that's a very interesting dichotomy, right, when you start to look at it, because right now Google's search engines pull off of other sites. So if I choose to put my information on Facebook, let's say, that search engine is actually going to Facebook, pulling that information and showing it up in their population. But that, if I happen to be an individual within the European Union, I can now go in and say, I might have posted that on Facebook and it's public information, but you can't use that in your search criteria. That's very interesting, right? That hasn't affected the US here, but I think that that's going to have a pretty big impact on the rest of the world in terms of how individuals will start to look at it and how they might think of that being a significant challenge, and making sure that there's a fine line between too much in the privacy space and actually taking advantage of individuals' information and actually getting good predictive analytics from the data.
So I'm much more bullish for those of you in Seattle. You know, I've been in Seattle 12 years. I love Seattle. The audience here is very optimistic, and there's going to be great companies coming right from the audience here. And here's why I'm optimistic. There are billions and billions and billions of dollars wasted on bad advertising. It's probably the most inefficient marketplace we still have. And one of the things that the Seattle area companies are doing is driving efficiencies, from E-Trade to buying real estate to just name the technology companies in town here that are doing fantastic things. And as a whole, I'll make a statement that most people will disagree with, but in time you'll come to agree. People do want to give more personal information to advertisers to make the advertising relevant. Irrelevant advertising is really noticed and really bites. I moved to Seattle and I used to get junk mail in my mail. Remember that thing called a mailbox? And it said, "Dear renter, you know, tired of renting, buy a house." I was like, don't they know I bought a house? That's just wasting trees. I don't get those anymore. On a personal note, maybe it's too much information. I get 3 Victoria's Secret catalogs to my house every time they deliver, because my wife bought something, my daughter bought something, my mother-in-law bought something from Canada. Surely, and those are expensive flyers, right? They're like $3 a piece. They're spending all 3. Can't they just dedupe the address, at least one? It's just wasting trees. Yellow pages, don't even get me started there. But little things like billboards and those sort of things. If you give personal information done the right way, and the reason why I'm optimistic, over the last 5 years, I have seen it happen with a court of public opinion. Don't you remember Google brought out that Google Circles or something, and everyone backlashed and they pulled it back, and Steve Jobs had to quickly apologize when they said they were turning off location tracking in your phone and they weren't, and they called it a bug? Remember that a couple of years ago? And the court of public opinion is really powerful because with so much social media and communication, great companies get identified and bad companies who breach trust get killed instantly. But I think, again, look at your industries. Many industries are driven by fee-based data or advertising-based models, even media, right? I can get an ad-based model and get something for free, or I can go to pay $3 and not have to give up my identity and buy the magazine or newspaper or whatever the case might be. I think there is ample opportunity in the Seattle skill sets, whether it be in big data, people coming off from Amazon or Microsoft, are going to do great things around advertising. And if you listen to the Madronas out there of the world, people who are backing on companies, look at Facebook, their mobile application. It's used all of the time, and it's actually got relevant advertisings. Check yourself how many times you actually click on the sponsored links because they're uncannily good versus how many times you clicked on a link on a website or saw a billboard, a digital billboard, for example. There's so much waste. And I do really think that as we keep moving along in the court of public opinion, there's going to be big opportunities because your customers do want to give you their data in a trusted way to make their advertising-based business model more relevant to them.
Andrew, do you want to weigh in on some of the pitfalls?
Yes. So one of the things that Peter raised is this data quality issue, which is a big issue. Traditionally, when we've done these type of analytics, it has been human-curated data, or data that's been through a process where it's been cleaned, sanitized, scrubbed, and so on, so that you're getting really correct data. And the problem is that I've been working with machine and sensor data for a long time, and it has exactly the same problems any other data source has. You have missing data, corrupted data, erroneous measurement, all sorts of things that goes on with that data. But the problem is that a lot of these data sources, we're getting millions or billions of records every second, and it never stops. And there is no way you can ever scrub that data, have people look at it, to kind of figure out. So this has been a challenge for a long time with a lot of the data models that I work with. To give an example for example, is social media. When people try and analyze social media is a really interesting echo chamber that only occasionally intersects with what's going on in reality. So we were doing a disaster response scenario for for Hurricane Sandy, where we were dealing with basically wanted to use social media to get a better sense of what's going on the ground. Yeah, they can look at their radar pictures and all the other stuff and whatever their first responders are saying, but they wanted to get a better understanding of kind of the layout of the disaster and what's going on, so they could get people there as soon as possible. So they wanted to look at social media. The problem with social media is that you have thousands of people tweeting about things that they never saw, or that they saw or heard secondhand, or that they saw on the news, or they're just, who knows why they're tweeting about it, because they felt like tweeting about it. And so that was always a challenge, was how do we separate those people from the people who are actually in the storm? And so the way we solved it for that particular case is we essentially took the Doppler radar, the real-time Doppler radar feed, which kind of shows you where the storm is as it's coming on land, and we did a spatial join with the Twitter fire hose. So basically, if Doppler radar says you're not tweeting from inside Hurricane Sandy, we're not going to pay attention to anything you're saying. And so that was a way we were able to use basically other machine-generated data to corroborate the data we were getting from other sources. And we do this more and more as we're building bigger models, because the rate of data and the diversity of data has been increasing, where we say, okay, I have this, say, satellite imaging source. And there's different satellite imaging sources you can use to, say, understand crop yields and things like that people like to do with satellite imaging. The problem is they're gappy, or there's holes, there's actually like pixel damage and stuff like that. So how do you get your values? Well, there's many different satellite companies with many different types of satellites. So we started measuring things different ways. So I want to measure this fact about reality, and how many different ways can I think of doing it? Well, there's lots of ways I can do. I can use several different measurements of the same type or of the same thing. So say taking many images of the same thing and averaging them together and say, you know what, all the error is going to fall away if I have 5 sources voting on the state of reality, and the noise floor will fall away. You can use different ways of measuring the same thing. So it's basically taking wildly different measurements, but you're computing indirectly a fact about reality from different sources. And this was actually the social media using, sensor corroboration of social media, which is done for many other things as well, incidentally. Is kind of an example of that. It's like, well, yeah, it may look real, but I can measure it for another way. They're not actually there. So, I'm just going to ignore them. And so this is, these have been many of the challenges we've faced. And we've actually, for us, because I've been working with machine-generated data where we couldn't clean it. And I used to work with a lot more of the traditional human clean data. We came up with a lot of techniques and a lot of methods for, we're not going to try and clean it. We're just going to throw more data at it and let the data decide what the state of reality is. But the problem with that is suddenly you've just exponentially increased the kind of like processing overhead to do your analytics, because now you're basically adding way more data in than is strictly necessary if it was cleaned to instead get the effect of having clean data.
Well, just to echo that, another example, we do the same thing. So when DOTs close roads, they do a good job of letting you know when they're closed, but they don't do a good job of letting you know when they're open. So as soon as we see not just one, but several GPS data points go across, we open the road. Because road closures are a major incident hassle, and then we can do things like that. Or someone has a flat tire on the side of a road, you don't paint the I-90 red because one data point says they're going 0 miles an hour, or someone threw a Starbucks drive-through right on the service road, 3 feet away. So we actually pour more data at it as well and let the data decide.
Yeah, it's actually, in a computer science, what they say, we basically do a lot of duck typing. So if it looks like, it walks like a duck, talks like it's a duck. And and this is actually used for identity, more and more for identity purpose now as well, where they don't really need to see your ID or know who you are. You just, I'm an Andrew-like person rather than Andrew. And so they have this very deep profile of what this Andrew-like person is, how they behave, what scenario, what they're likely to be doing in their behaviors. And so there's like, we don't know exactly, we haven't seen your government-issued ID, but you're an Andrew-like person, so we're going to call you Andrew. And it takes surprisingly little data before you can uniquely identify people by their likeness rather than, some specific entity identifier.
So we all know, are you a duck, are you a husky or a cougar, what are you?
But actually, I think that brings us very nicely to our next point.
Actually, Emily, do you mind if I just weigh in one more thing? I think it's really relevant. I think the other issue or challenge that we have is around resources, qualified individuals who actually know how to use the tools. I don't know how many of you have seen, but a lot of universities have changed a curriculum to specifically integrate a data scientist major. Obviously, MIT has had one for quite a while, but I think that we're starting to see that as more of a norm than an exception. And that major would include individuals with a business background, a statistics background, and then an MIS or an IT background. And I think that skill set is very coveted. I mean, you're starting to see it at the more junior levels as well with a lot of the STEM programs in the elementary schools, and as you get into the high schools, and then the universities are starting to catch on, and we're starting to see that across the different campuses. Both, again, my background, I live in San Francisco, but work and oversee some of the markets and data analytics in San Jose and San Francisco, and also the Pacific Northwest. And the curriculums that are getting into put in place, are shocking. And that Stanford actually is going to have, I think, their first graduating class in the data scientist major 2 years from now, right? And you start to think about that. Wow, that's kind of scary because we're way behind the curve on this. You start to think about other countries internationally that are already ahead of us, and that there's been some interesting statistics that have been set up by a lot of the executives from a lot of the large companies that have basically issued a concern notice that the technology capabilities of the students within the U.S. is going to be challenged, and that frankly, they don't believe that there's the capacity to fill the needs. So, I'm bullish in the fact that we're starting to see those curriculums start to build out, and hopefully we'll continue to see that. But just seeing the audience here, I think that that's extremely relevant, and that there's also a trend towards that. So a very positive thing, but something that I think that we need to continue to push is just a community.
A couple of you have weighed in on the privacy issue, but I do want to return to that for a minute because I think that's on everybody's minds right now. It's a really, I think, newsworthy issue. And you mentioned, Kevin, this idea that advertising can be better targeted, and that you could have smarter advertisers if they knew more about you. And then Andrew, you mentioned that it's relatively easy to identify somebody from even just a few data points. And so I think that does raise a lot of privacy concerns, and it has a lot of people, particularly privacy advocates, really concerned about the future of predictive analytics. And Hollywood has sort of made their their movies about that, but I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say about whether predictive analytics and privacy can coexist.
Well, I'm a Canadian, first of all, and I'm proud of the Americans. I'm proud of the Americans. This whole NSA thing, with the government spying, congratulations. This is the best country in the world. And the power of the press here is phenomenal. And, latency of communication is non-existent. And, when people burn American flags, people get mad at that. But at least they have the right. And that's what makes America so strong. And as you look at these privacy laws, there's privacy laws around healthcare, banking, and flights. There isn't privacy laws, with the exception of the UK, and they're going to get blown away, personally, I think, because Facebook and Amazon aren't going to make you sign a click wrap when you shop on Facebook or Amazon in the UK only sort of model. But the power of the American population and press is phenomenal, and they've done a really good job, and that's why I'm so bullish on this area. Because if someone breaches privacy, they're going to get killed. And not physically, but in the marketplace, including the U.S. government. And Americans are so strong at this and so innovative that I'm not worried about the privacy issue at all. I really am not. It's going to move. It's going to be healed. It's going to go back and forth. Those of you who have children, they should learn simple rules, like if it rhymes with ong, don't post it on Facebook, right? Bong, thong, bong, pong, whatever. And they'll learn those things, just like my mother learned that don't type in all caps, right? And don't blind carbon copy my brother when you're talking about his birthday gift. People have to understand these new technologies, and people will understand social media as well. But I think a lot of people are making up problems that don't exist quite yet. And if people get burned, it'll get pulled back, and it'll move, it'll flow. But look at all the big companies that have really moved, Snapchat and others that are worth billions of dollars because they've done a better job of giving people relevant content. Don't think of it as advertising. When you're out looking for Starbucks on your phone, or you're out buying a minivan, you want information. And back to, there is so many billions of dollars wasted for inefficiency in the marketplace. Again, it's easier to sell painkillers than vitamins. So I'm really proud that I live in the United States, and I'm proud that I live in Seattle, because I'm really bullish on this marketplace and talking to young entrepreneurs and new companies. Magic's going to happen here. And I think that we'll figure it out. We'll make some mistakes as a society. We'll step forward, we'll step back, we'll apologize. Steve Jobs did it. Google did it. And, INRIX will make mistakes. But the time is so valuable, and advertising dollars are so valuable, and those are two models that people can't get enough of in terms of more efficiency. And I challenge you, and I'm having conversations in Q&A about what you guys are doing, because I think you should take advantage of it as well.
Yeah, and if you two want to weigh in quickly, I do want to make sure that we have time for questions. So please feel free.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. It's interesting in our business, generally speaking, the analytics that we run will actually strip out any personally identifiable information. We'll go with the Andrew-like models just to make sure that we're not getting close to being on the border there. It's interesting, Kevin, hearing what you're saying. I think pragmatically, it's probably the way the business works. But it's something that we are very careful with as a consulting firm, and it's very interesting that we've actually developed a practice, which I'm not directly part of, to address the privacy concerns, because there are a lot of challenges that are out there. And specifically to your point, that companies want to take advantage of that data because it's extremely relevant. It's very interesting to me, to give you a perfect example. One of my neighbors recently moved out, and I got some advertisements in my mailbox for dental type of things, right? I got a toothbrush. I got an advertisement for toothpaste. And my first thought was, I've got 2 young daughters, we must not have brushed well and we've got some cavities. No. What had happened is that actually our neighbors had sold the house and a dentist was moving in next door. And so you think about that, right? I didn't even know that the house was going up for sale. It had already been sold, and that the advertising agencies already knew that the individual that had purchased the house profession was a dentist, right? And so they basically were soliciting me because it was likely I was going to go converse with this individual, and I was going to actually start to think about what he said, and start to move down the path. So, I think that I'm in a fortunate position, if you will, because of the fact that we do a lot of finance, risk, and compliance analytics. But I think that a lot of the companies are going to be challenged with this. I mean, obviously, what I referenced in terms of the EU in the past, the couple days of what they found, I don't think that this is going to be a harmonious activity going forward. I think there's going to be a lot of challenge. Yes, I think that we'll get to the right answer, but I think that it's going to go through some trials and tribulations, and I think a few folks are going to get scars from it. So, I think it's very interesting, and again, I think that's why we've seen the privacy team come out of that.
Let me just do a really quick poll here,
Yeah.
really quick. So, as you might know, I share my location with my kids. My kids all know where I am with tracking, so you can ask them when they're going to be home as opposed to where are they, because we know where they all are. But question for you, I'll bias it. I would gladly share my location with Alaska Airlines. I want them to know I'm in line, come get me, or that you mean the fastest route to the airport, because drive time to the airport is very stressful. Question for you, would you all share your location with your favorite airline and let them track you? Not very many. Okay, so you guys are all over 35. No, that's interesting. My point is, you really will want to share your information with Alaska Airlines. And Alaska Airlines won't, but I just use them as an example carrier. There's going to be so much benefit, because Alaska Airlines knows 4 things, and they know your location, they know your flight time, they know the traffic conditions to get you there, they know the line at TSA. They can be very helpful to send you an alarm that says you need to cut your meeting tomorrow right now and leave. There's a Mariners game, get going.
I think that the example of Target recently shows that when we give our information to these companies, we don't know how well they're protecting that information, and that it can be used unscripted.
Yeah, it's a matter of trust, I think, is what he's getting at.
Yeah. I'm going to put a little bit different spin on this than the 2 other gentlemen up here. A lot of people, when they think about privacy, they think about who am I sharing my data with, or who owns my data or has my data in their database. Because traditionally, that's kind of been the concern. LexisNexis has all this information on every person that lives in the US, and so we want to control who has access to it. And a lot of times, like Visa, they have good controls internally over who has access to your data, because they know that trust is important. But what has happened is that with big data and with the advance of analytics, we now have the case where people are basically reconstructing all of those databases with exhaust, like completely, wildly unrelated data exhaust. And the mathematical techniques and the analytic techniques are starting to come around, where it doesn't matter if it's anonymous or incidental measurements of things that you don't even think about, but you can start reconstructing all of that personal information. And so at some point, you kind of lose control at a policy level over what other people can know about you. You can't say, well, everyone must have this policy that, because I can point to Visa or MasterCard and say, I know where you guys live, and I know you have a database of all my transactions. But the companies and organizations that have reconstructed all that information from ambient data that nobody cares about, and which really can't be controlled because anybody can kind of measure all those bits and pieces, I think that's really going to drive a lot of the conversation going forward, because suddenly it doesn't really matter who you want to share with it. You've already shared it with everybody. You don't even realize it. And, that's, I think, going to be, going forward. It's not here yet because most people, one, don't really think about it going on. And also the technology is still very immature. But as this goes forward, that's going to drive much more of the privacy conversation, I think.
Fantastic. I kind of get the impression that there are some folks in the audience who might have some questions. We do have a microphone in the back, and if you don't mind popping up there so everybody can hear your question.
Former journalist here. As a question about questions. Because Andrew, you were pointing out, and I think on the pitfalls was sort of asking the wrong question, asking the right question is really critical. And now I'm no longer a journalist, I'm a business stakeholder and the recipient of the outputs of predictive analytics. So what are the drivers behind consumer behavior on X, Y, and Z? So I want to know from you how to get to the right question. And part of that is a why consumers do what they do, as well as what drives them, but what's the context around that as well? And can predictive analytics help me do that? What are the wrong questions to ask? What are the right questions? What are the wrong questions? And no offense to any of you or anyone in this room, but sometimes, you get your geeks all together, and I'm a geek as well in some respects, and there's a arrogance. I'm right, and I've done all of these, I have these big data, bases, and I've pulled from them, and I have this model that works for everything. It's going to analyze everything and give you the right answers. And I really want to know from the business stakeholder standpoint, what are the questions to ask to sort of make sure the pitfalls aren't ones that we're going to suffer from later, like whether it's, correlation, causation, those kinds of things. So lots of questions in that question about questions.
So a couple of things. On the question of how do you ask the right question? So in a distant past life, I actually did a lot of work on an area of mathematics called algorithmic information theory, where you don't ask the question, you basically reverse the data and pull the algorithms out of it, that then you can predict the behavior. You just run the algorithm forward. So, and it was much of the kind of where I talked about where we have a model of normal. We throw as much data in as possible. I mean, I also went to school for chemical engineering, where that's actually how we build chemical process models. It's actually not a thing it's a very dirty field. The math actually doesn't work out. You'll get 2 + 2 = 5 if you run all the equations through. So you have to just throw as much data as possible in until you kind of get this equilibrium, and this model of behavior falls out of the system. So as much as there's many other people in many other areas of predictive analytics where they really do construct the question, or they know what they're going to ask before they go into it, and they say, this is the question I want to ask, so these are the data sources I'm going to use to answer this question, which incidentally is a huge source of bias.
Right.
I've always been very much more of the mind I throw as much data from as many different sources as possible. Hopefully I cancel out the bias, cancel out the errors, the noise, and then see what patterns pull out of the system, and then I'll try and push those patterns forward. So I don't say immediately, I'm looking for this. I'm just looking for an interesting pattern or something that stands out in the data model, and then I'm going to push that forward and see if it has predictive effects, or see if it does correlate with some behavior going forward. And I said that's my view of it, but it's also the view coming from where I've come from in the predictive analytics space.
It's funny. I have a much more. I feel like I'm ignorant here for a second. I have a much simpler rule of thumb that I always use. I always ask the business people who are asking me, "Why are you asking?" Because people often ask the data, and they really don't want the data. They want the answer. For example, you go up to a mall and ask the lady at the front, "Where's the AT&T store?" Her answer should not be up the escalator to the right. It should be, "Why are you asking?" "Oh, I'm looking to buy my Father's Day gift." That's the question that you should try to answer. A lot of companies are out there, to use that analogy, trying to show you where indoor mall mapping or where the AT&T is. Very few companies got it nailed in terms of what you should buy your father for Father's Day. So when I have a lot of business owners, in fact, a lot of licensees come to us and they ask us for data, I'll often ask that question, "Why are you asking?" The analogy I often use is when you drop your wedding ring in the street, look where you dropped your ring. Don't go look at where the light post is. A lot of people like to go look where the light post is, where they have visibility to the data, because I can see things over there. But look for your ring where you dropped it, even if you don't have the data. And it's a good catch to find people saying, "Oh, I thought I could get the answer based on, I heard you had data availability." And that's just my little simple rule of thumb. I just keep asking until they can't ask any longer, "Why are you asking?" And that's usually the real question. And I think we started the panel by saying that, which is the hardest part is to find the right question. And that's a completely different answer than yours. Maybe we end up with the same answer, but it's a lot easier to remember than what you just said.
Well, no, that is the right. I mean, that is the right question, though, because usually people don't know what they're looking for. There was a whole area, recent development in analytics. They call it activity analytics, or something that's very similar to what I'm talking about. In the intelligence community, they call it activity-based intelligence, and it's where they realized that they had a really hard time getting the analysts to ask the right right questions. And as a result, they missed a lot of things that in retrospect were like bloody obvious. And they're like, oh, I can't believe we didn't see that coming. And so that was actually what developed a lot of these new kinds of analytics where you basically just throw it all in, pull out the patterns and push forward. It's like, I'm not going to bias myself by asking a question. I'm going to say, show me anomalies, and then we ask questions about the pattern of anomalies we're seeing. So it's like a first order filter so that we don't have to know the question until we have at least something interesting that we can ask a question about. But
I'd weigh in from the side of, I think the scientific method is actually a very useful tool, and frankly, I think you need to get to a specific question, because if you're going to go after, 1,000 darts, you're never going to hit the center, if you will. And I think, the other piece of the equation that, will guide you is that once you have a question and you can get it defined down to a point where it's manageable and it's tangible and you can actually address it, I think that you can go after the data and you can go after the right data. And one story that I'll share with you, you guys might have heard it, which I think is extremely relevant, is around what Chase or JP Morgan did in terms of advertising, and they were trying to get feedback from the millennials about how they should right size or create a mortgage specifically for these individuals, much like the credit cards company have done in the past around, I'll create the Just For You, American Express Blue, et cetera. And what they did was they went on an advertising campaign, and as opposed to asking the question, which is, how do we best get information from the millennials and what is the potential impacts of going after it in certain ways, they basically said, let's set up a Twitter feed and let's get the tweets in and see how it goes. Well, what actually turned out, as opposed to getting feedback about how they'd like to be solicited and how they'd like to actually create mortgage packages for them, is that basically JP Morgan was blamed for the credit crisis. And they ended up taking down the tweet in a matter of days because of the negative feedback that they were actually getting. Now, how much money did they spend on that campaign? Or you start to think about it, it's tens of millions of dollars to kind of put it forward and figure out where they wanted to go. But they didn't ask the question, is there data out there that could support whether this would be a good initiative or not? Because they didn't go to social media, they didn't start looking at actual feed activity that could have basically told them the answer to the question if they actually were asking a question. Now, and I guess to kind of continue to move that along, the way that I look at it is there's two ways to ask a question. You can have an operational question, which is going to give you a yes or no answer. Is this transaction fraudulent or not? And then there's the strategic look at it, where you're going to say, okay, of this population, which one is going to drive the greatest outcome? Meaning, maybe I'm trying to get a pricing strategy in place. How do I bucket these goods? And so, depending on the type of question that you're going to go after, there's a slightly different focus that you want to take. But obviously, getting to the right question is going to be key. And frankly, what I would say is the tools and techniques are the last question that you want to go after. You really want to drive to what the outcome that you're trying to achieve is. And frankly, I think you need to have an idea of what your answer is even before you go into it, because if you don't have an expectation of what you're going to get to either prove or disprove, I think that you're going to go down a rabbit hole and start to go off on tangents and actually miss your overall objective.
Okay, great. Next question.
Implicit in your discussion, at least not mentioned, is, so what does this cost, and what's the relative balance between hardware and software that makes this a business model that's going to work for organizations?
Well, I would say that's the toughest question. That's like saying, how much does it cost to build a website? You can get one for $9.99, or you can spend billions of dollars from Amazon. If you're Amazon, that's really hard. It depends on your use case in question. Back to the there's just such a spectrum. If the definition of big data is data that's so large that we don't have systems to handle it, I would suggest some of the 10 megabyte PowerPoints that I have are big data, because my systems can't handle it. They get rejected, right? They send it out and it gets bounced back, fail. So being a little bit, trying to be a little bit funny, but that's an example of it. It's very low cost, as it's called, make a PDF and send it out that way, Kevin, you bonehead. Right to some of the things that I think you're doing, Andrew, that are around crop analysis, that are billion-dollar decisions that you're going to make the investment in terms of, today people make these decisions anyway. The question is, how much can I spend to make a better decision, whether I'm right or wrong? And if the answer is, it's probably about 10 to 20%, I would say, of the value you're expecting, most people go ahead. there are so many opportunities in the 10 to 20% range that people are busy building whole ecosystems around them. If you're going to spend 50% to get a 100% answer, I don't think that's the right investment yet. Wait for the costs to go down and the analytics to get better.
Okay, great. Another question?
Yeah, I had a question about how predictive analytics can be used with anonymizing the data in order to maybe address some of the privacy concerns. I think of things like Craigslist. Part of the reason Craigslist is so popular and so successful is because the email addresses are anonymized and the people respond to some relay. I was wondering if companies, in order to avoid litigation risk, things like Target, that have had horrible press because of the data breaches, would use, some sort of, rather than, Kevin Foreman being the name of the person, it being user 1234, or you know what I mean, like some sort of.
Sure. I'll give you the one-line answer for us as INRIX. So we get these billions of data points every day. It's all anonymized. And Ford and GM and Chrysler and FedEx wouldn't let us know that it's, Joe Smith driving down the I-90. It's just a data point.
But do they know? Does Ford know?
Well, this is the slippery slope thing. So we'll give you a real. At first, everything was completely anonymized, right? ID, we get often held up in the press as the good boys for big data because we're not doing NSA spying, because most of the billion of us who fight traffic every day think solving worldwide traffic congestion is a good human cause. Okay, so great. So we get all this anonymous data coming in. And then along comes these fleets and says, you know what, we have an insurance liability if one of our drivers goes rogue or postal. So you know what, we do as a company want to track our drivers to know how many of them are speeding. And therefore, we do want to identify it, but we want to keep it to their organization. So that, and think about it. When you get in your car in the morning, wouldn't you like us to say, good morning, Linda, your fastest route to work is, and know it's Linda and not your husband, Steve. That's a benefit to you, because when your husband drives, and you'll want to give that data to us again, I think, and we'll move the slide. But today, it's very anonymized, and for the use cases that we've been involved in.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Kevin. I've been dealing with these data sources for, 7, 8 years. And like human identifiable stuff, and it's pervasively anonymized. They're very strict about it, and they always have been. In most of the industries I've worked with, they don't like that. Now, the ability to actually go back and figure out who that anonymous person is exists, and it's been getting stronger every day. I mean, if you deal with a lot of the companies that do these kinds of like anonymous look, they like some of the car companies, they can know what the VIN number is that actually matches the anonymous thing that they're actually giving you. And so they can go back to the specific vehicle, which then can be tracked back to the specific owner, which and so on and so forth. So there is the ability to reconstruct it. And then there's, today, as things have, back 10 years ago, that was actually a really hard kind of problem to de-anonymize data like that, because the tools didn't exist, the kind of data availability wasn't there. But we're getting to the point where now, even though it is anonymous, we've got the tools and the data availability has gotten better and good enough that you can, as a more practical matter, de-anonymize much of that data if you want to. But, and this is the important point, companies go out of their way to make sure they don't. And it's a policy that will go from top to bottom in the organization. They're like, we don't want to know. We don't look at the data. We just want to know, is an entity A doing, activity Y? And that's as far as they go. So to the extent that, these things are going on, a lot of it's been self-enforced. And it's partly because of liability, because of PR, public relations, your image. If you can say, we do not, we have this really strong privacy policy where we anonymize everything, employees in the company have no access to this data, outside of extremely constrained things, we audit everything. And that is the way it works in a lot of organizations that have a lot of personally identifiable information. That's kind of like where we're at today in terms of privacy.
Yeah, I would agree. It's interesting to hear it more from your side as well, with the focus of where we do our analytics. But privacy and personally identifiable information and payment card information is definitely a significant focus of a lot of the clients that we work with. And I think that the biggest driver is that you get 10 different data points, and you might get a license plate from this individual, you might get a name from this individual, and you start to think about how everything comes together, that various points points, when aggregated, actually fall into the buckets of PII or PCI. And it's very challenging to start to say, okay, well, if I get this data set and that one doesn't have any personal information, then I'm okay. But if I get it compiled or aggregated with these other data sets and they're all from different sources, and I combine them and I start to make transaction information or start to establish relationships between them, you could be infringing in some of the PII space. And as I mentioned earlier, it's interesting to see one of the practices that we've actually built out is actually addressing it, because there's different rules in the US, there's different rules in other countries, and they're very, some are very prescriptive and some are very, I'll say, very not allowing any personal information to be shared, and that could be any different data point. So it's something that I'm glad to hear it, frankly, because I think it puts us at risk, but I think it also might detract from the ability to be more effective in pushing information to people that do want it.
I think we have time for one last question. If you'd like to take it.
So recently, more and more e-commerce companies start to cooperate with social media platforms like Amazon and Twitter, Alibaba and Weibo. And do you think the data from the social media platforms will help the companies, e-commerce companies, to analyze and predict the consumer behavior?
That's a great question. Andrew talked about being the chamber. I didn't get a chance to sort of disagree, because maybe it's use case dependent. For traffic data, people don't lie today. When someone says, oh my gosh, there's an accident ahead of me, and they say that on Twitter, we mine that and we find it very valuable. Often it's happening faster than the police and DOTs can give it to us, or our own people. And we found great success in mining that for our use cases, where you kind of hinted towards people not telling the truth or retweeting bad information or something.
Well, let me qualify that. It's data sources like that are highly biased. And so there's been this thing where data analytics has been siloed. I'm only going to look at the Twitter fire hose, and I'm going to base my model of reality based on the Twitter fire hose. And when they do that, you get a very interesting view. Justin Bieber rules the planet, and all sorts of other strange things happen. But
yeah, he does.
Absolutely.
Yeah. and so that was really, what I was talking about, is that it's highly biased. And so as long as you correct for the bias, or you have ways to actually normalize it, then it's okay. And it's just another signal, because we all add this source in, it's biased this way. We had another source that's biased a different way. And you hope if you have enough different things pulling on the viewpoint and the perspective, it kind of hones in or kind of narrows in on objectivity to the extent it exists.
Well, I'll give you one more concrete example that I'd like to give, which is Comcast. Does anybody work here for Comcast, by the way? One of the most hated companies on the planet, right? Very few people like Comcast, but they get one of the highest grades for their Twitter and social media feed. They do customer support through Twitter, and they actually answer, they actually acknowledge, and they actually answer, and they actually do help solve your problems. And Comcast, right, whose brand is down here, is actually moving their brand up because social media. So it's not so much marketing, but great customer service is marketing. And to give them credit, their VP should get a big raise. They've done a great job, and Comcast is one of the best brands on Twitter right now. And for those of us who are a little bit jaded, my kids think Comcast is a cool, really fun company. And it's like, come on, guys. But anyway, it's back to people and personalities. The other thing that's slightly different with privacy in the web is transparency. I don't hear a lot of times the word transparency. I just find businesses that are transparent are just knocking it out of the park. Even if you're wrong and make mistakes. I mentioned, the Steve Jobs thing. He said I made a mistake, bug, whatever. But transparency, people see it, they sense it, and social media is a great way. And I would encourage your companies, for example, Nordstrom, some of those you might work at Nordstrom, they want to have all their employees to have personal accounts and Nordstrom accounts on Facebook and have 2 accounts, which is really hard to do because Facebook authenticates you from your mobile devices. And don't do that. My advice is and have all of your employees represent your company the same way we're all our own secretaries, we're all our own data analysts someday. We all represent the firm, and I think social media is a great way for you to engage. You talked about store theft with employees. Great things you guys should do throughout your company. The number of people who surprise me still today that are typically the demographics of people in the room who say, I don't do Facebook, I don't do Snapchat, I don't do Twitter. That's like my parents saying, I don't do email. Come and talk to me, write me a letter. And the answer is, I Facebook my wife, I tweet my wife, I Snapchat my wife, I phone my wife, and I still miscommunicate with her. Right? You need as many vehicles to communicate with the most intimate audience you have, which is your customers. that you can possibly have. And I think social media, if you guys aren't all over social media, you're missing one of the most important communication vehicles of our time. It's really, really
Take us
important.
out, Pete.
Well, yeah, one other thing I would just add, I agree with the comments of the other panelists. I've seen a lot of companies create their own social media solution internally. We, example, at PwC do that as well. And basically, it's a great way to share information quicker. It's something that we feel has a very effective way to connect people, to collaborate, et cetera. And I think that you're going to start to see in the future that not only will the Facebooks and the other Twitter companies that are doing this, they'll start to integrate the data that they can with appropriate security. And this is probably a couple years down the road with a lot of the internal social media sites that have been set up. And I've seen a lot of the clients that I work for set these up because of the valuable information that they can get, and that they can start mining it not only from buying it from other sources or collaborating with other sources, but also just from the large employee bases that they have, the international presences, et cetera.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight, and big round of applause for our excellent panel.